Obviously, as we are here, we are Earthlings. Talk, discussion, and debate on topics concerning themes of the supernatural. When we try to quantify, to qualify the terms, the terminology, I wind up wondering if, in terms of practicality, supernatural really means, because I suppose in like a hypothetical principle where they try to say this word means beyond natural the phenomenology of nature, then we're human. Then that would be where the conversation would have to stop on any topic. Or we're left with questions of how such a topic could be a discussable topic. And that's what original agnosticism was about before it became about a weakened ignorance plea. I disagree with Jack and Glenn on that point of the definition of agnosticism, and I'd encourage her because since our From the Heart, her 50-minute talk about atheism was, and I admired it much because I share in that element of self-discovery when you deconvert and you deconvert and have a deep appreciation for what it means to be alive in this life. But yes, agnosticism would say that it was reactionary to a sect of Christians called the Gnostics, who said they had attained a certain gnosis about the veracity of various supernatural claims, and insisted that things like God's existence and Jesus being his son were things that could be known. The Bible true were things that could be known to complete and certainty. And so then there was a reaction against that by Thomas Henry Huxley, who said, no, these such matters can't be known. So yeah, but this was not said to disallow debate or discussion. It's a positive conclusion, saying, well, as far as you can go on this topic, we think once you go off on tangents as they present themselves, you'll wind up having to, I suppose, admit that it's beyond the limitations of what's knowable to a human being to assert the existence or non-existence of, say, an afterlife existence. Now, why that's one reason why that's actually wise and a point of closure at the same time is actually in the lyrics of Prince's song on the Batman soundtrack called "The Future." I think it's the first track. Though there is in the following line a brief mention of afterlife. Well, yeah, afterlife prospects, suggesting that we should behave a certain way while here on Earth, which I don't agree with. Um, but yeah, so I'm more into agnosticism con, concerning afterlife, because after all, it is called afterlife. The pilot episode of Penn and Teller's bullshit is about the topic of talking to the dead and people who make money from, suppose somebody that you are close to has died, and then you're in tears, and somebody else comes up to you saying, "Well, if you pay to come to my presentation, I can contact this relative of yours." And you watch these people that are extremely emotional and grief stricken, only to have these snakes who often can even have the two reading techniques, hot and cold. They get cold. The hot reading is where you might meet who you think is a fellow griever attending the the evening with you, and they're like, "What are you here for?" And then you're like, "Well, my great aunt has passed away recently. I'm wondering if the speaker can contact her for me." And and then that person gets certain details, and then they wind up being an assistant to the person who contacts the dead, and that's called a hot reading, where outright facts are gathered from a person prior to John Edwards walking to the stage, or whoever it is that's putting on the talking to the dead session. A cold reading is where they sort of narrow in from. I'm getting name begins with name that begins with B, and yeah, so they tend to start with broad broad potential judgments that could be said about anyone, and then honing in on a gradient from the general to the specific, as the person in the audience is overwhelmed by the seeming coincidence, the convergence of coincidences into claim that none of it was coincidental, while the person claiming to contact the dead has absolutely applied a methodology. So I think, yeah, Harry Houdini became infuriated after losing his mother, and detracted from being a magician. Magicians like Penn and Teller, I really admire them. Um, not only for being atheists, but for being open about how they understand that their magic is tricks, and what they're doing is artwork. It's artificial and performance. So because they don't want to be confused or considered amongst religious miracle performer claimants. So yeah, so they do it, and it gets difficult to be sure if they consider themselves outright fraudsters and are saying things like, "Oh, but it's such a competitive world as we evolved," and So, or whether they generally, it's hard though. It's hard. It really is hard to think that on these people's behalves, like John Edward, that he could he could truly believe he's contacting grieving, crying people's dead loved ones, or not extorting their grief. Um, or that they're not saying things like, well, then if I'm such a phony, why are they even attending my seminars? And answering instead of after giving them apparent answers, firing back at criticisms with two questions. If I'm such a fraud, why are they even attending? Well, you made a claim and then charged them money. So, if human rights acts didn't have clauses stipulating religious freedom, religious freedom, if you again wouldn't have the prospect of saying, well, then the fucking state, the state's extorting the grieving potentially by endorsing in principle the misplace of trust in bizarre people like John Edwards and yeah. So, in addition to churches teaching you aren't truly human, that's another reason why I don't think it needs to be spelled out on the Human Rights Act that you have the rights to religion. They obviously know that they've got tax exemptions as well. It's like, what more do they want to take over? Why doesn't it say you have the right to turn left at a left corner, or to become a member of a karate gymnasium, or you have the right to choose between Hungry Jack's and McDonald's and KFC. It's stating the obvious, because if these places are wanted, then they'll be sought out for. But by having them printed on the Human Rights Act, some could be pushed to disregard any and all considerations of being unbelievers. B, being given the impression by the state that unbelief is not acceptable to the state. C, that the state doesn't consider them truly human unless they're involved in a religious organization. D, that their self-definition is contingent upon involvement in a religious club, and all sorts of things. So yeah, if they want to stand back and say things like, well, if this person can say this, then the state stands to be liable for all these ranges of claims. Like, well, yeah, think about what is the scope of the definition of humanity, and why you're shafting over this little implied side pot community called the LGBT community, because that's more appropriate. And meanwhile, those Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy have been admitted to have been lies. Haven't we got a great deal of theology coming up after the break?